So about a year ago, I said goodbye. I published the 400th episode of Stageworthy, and I told you that that was it. Stageworthy was over, that after 7 years, Stageworthy was done. I was leaving it behind me, and I meant it at the time. Almost nonstop for 7 years, I'd put out episode after episode every week, recording at least one episode a week. Sometimes I would record 2 to 3 episodes a week. It's an exhausting pace. I was done. Or so I thought. And then 2025 started. And rhetoric from the United States made me start thinking about Canada's place in the world, about Canada's place within itself. And I started thinking about how theater and culture sit in all of that. And I started thinking about how Canada has this habit of downplaying its own. Like our theater, our television, our movies, they're not as good as what comes from the States. Now, there are differences between what's produced in Canada and what's produced in the US. We have different systems, and we have different systems of funding, which means that different work gets created. But I do think that there's a lot of great work that happens in Canada in the arts. And, my focus is theater, and I've been thinking a lot about theater's place in Canada and the world since this 51st state rhetoric started in the United States. And I started to think about how I had a lot to say still, or even more now. I'm an opinionated person. I still wanted to be celebrating Canadian artists and Canadian theater makers. And to me, there was one way to do that, and that was to bring Stageworthy back and to make sure that we were having important conversations, not just interviews, which I think are also important, interviewing artists. And I want to talk to artists that are well-known and artists that I think that you, as the audience, really should know. And I want to talk to people who are like theater in general. One of the problems with theater in Canada is that the people who are the greatest fans of theater are the people who make it. And so that's who ends up consuming a lot of the content around theater. And that's not bad. The people who make it should be fans of it, but I think there needs to be more to it than that. In the United States and in the UK and in other places in the world, there are fans of theater, people who love the theater for itself, who go to see multiple things a year. But Canada has this thing where our own homegrown art is not seen as worthy unless it finds success in the States. And I want to combat that. I think that we need to look at that, and we need to talk about that, and we need to be looking at the way that we talk about theater, the way that we talk about theater both to ourselves and the way that we advertise it and the way that we talk about it in the world outside of the theater. We need to be careful that we're not talking about theater as though we're only talking to the people who make it. We need to really watch that. And so I want to have these conversations about issues and about important things that we should be talking about. I want to talk to people from all over the country. I live in Toronto, and Toronto is a very busy theatrical place, and so there's a lot of attention that I pay to Toronto because that's who's approaching me. I'm getting press releases from Toronto and things like that. I am making an effort to both talk to people who are outside of Toronto. I'm still going to talk to the people in the Toronto theater scene, but I want to talk to people from all over Canada. And I also want to do showcases of different areas in Canada. So I want to talk about the theater scene in St. John's, Newfoundland, or Edmonton, in Vancouver, in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I want to talk about the theater scenes in those places and sort of like introduce those places to people who don't live there. Because of the way that Canada is, we have these great open spaces and theater scenes in sort of silos. But if we were to be able to share our theater, we could get so much more out of it. one of the things that had driven my thinking about ending Stageworthy was the fact that I had been for 7 years just pumping money into it, paying for the website, paying for editing software, paying for hosting. And I'd never seen a return on that investment financially. And because the cost of living was rising and because of everything else, I got to the point where I had to say, I cannot afford to do this anymore. So I started a Patreon, and I said, if I can get a certain number of backers, then I can start Stageworthy again. And I got it. So that's one of the reasons why I'm talking to you, because a group of people decided that Stageworthy was worth enough to them to return, was worth enough to them for them to put money into it, to back it financially. Things that I want to provide to the backers whenever possible, and it's not always going to be possible, but whenever I can, I want to give them an advance listen to a podcast. They are people who back the podcast on Patreon are going to be sort of a brain trust. We're going to talk together about panel topics and things like that. And they're going to have the opportunity to ask questions of the guests that I have on the program. And if that sounds like it's interesting to you, I'd love to have you there. You can find the Patreon at patreon.com/Stageworthy. If you're watching on YouTube and you haven't already, please make sure that you like this video, hit the subscribe button, and there's the bell thing if you want to be notified of these. But if you're listening on a podcast app, so you've got the podcast coming into your ear holes through either just a speaker or like I do with earphones in, then I would love for you to subscribe or follow if you're on Apple Podcasts. Make sure that you do that so that every time I release an episode of Stageworthy, it will be delivered right to your mobile device or to your computer. I would love to have you as a regular listener. And if you are enjoying the podcast at any point, please feel free to go on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a review, because those help too. This week for my first episode, I'm talking to Graham Isador. Graham is a writer that in my years circling the theater industry, I've seen Graham's name come up a lot. Graham is a staff writer for the Globe and Mail. He's written many different plays, as well as a podcast documenting his experience with vision loss called Shortsighted that was released by the CBC. Graham's new show, Truck, is being produced this week as this episode comes out. It's opening this week on the 26th at the Factory Theatre in Toronto. And so, here's my conversation with Graham Isador. How long have you been at the Globe and Mail for full-time?
I started full-time there in January, so I had been freelancing for them for the past couple of years, kind of on and off for a while. And this opportunity came out to be part of the pursuits team as the healthy living reporter. So basically what happened is like that's a new role. And when I interviewed, I was like, hey, can I continue doing the stuff that I have been doing for you guys over there? So that had included health and fitness, that included a bit of style, as well as talking about disability and travel as well too. So all those things in tandem kind of came together and now fall under the umbrella of what my role is over there. So yeah, I've been there since January full time. And that was it's a real godsend. I'm super grateful for the job.
Yeah, I'm sure. It's, I mean, one of the things I think that generally when people think about what working at a newspaper looks like, we all have very Hollywood ideas of what it might look like the day to day, like people running around and that sort of thing. I imagine it's not quite like that.
I mean, I think it fits a lot of the expectations of what I had for it in some ways. Like it's like I cut my teeth at Vice many years ago, as one of the first major journalism jobs that I picked up after freelancing for the better part of my early 20s. And Vice was a very specific place in terms of just like a lot of the good and bad that gets thrown around about that place is pretty true. It was fueled on a lot of different vices, like the namesake, and there was a beer tap in in the office and all these
Right.
other things. And the Globe, like, it really hits at these like yeah, a lot of like what I had imagined like a newspaper would look like growing up. So, there's breaking news, there's people going on, we're the first to know about a bunch of stuff going there. And my particular role is funny because I think I exist as this interesting novelty to them a lot of times. So, I was coming in specifically to kind of continue on some of the type of work that I had been doing at Vice and a lot of the first person essay stuff that is rooted in a little bit of humor, but a lot of just like perspective and pushing that stuff forward and is very voicey. And that's different than a lot of what has existed at the Globe previous
Mm.
to be kind of coming out there. So I think that there's that perception of like what, the Aaron Sorkin ideal of it all, like I think is true in terms of a lot of people for the Globe. And then, then I roll in and tell them some silly project I'm working on that week or, um, whatever kind of tickles my fancy in some ways there. So, yeah, I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to work there because it's just the ability to pursue a lot of different facets that have been interesting to me for a long
Yeah.
time. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
for sure. Um, let's jump in and talk about trucks, since that's the theater thing that's like right at the forefront. You're working on it right now. Um, just as a start, tell me about truck.
yeah. So, truck as a concept, the taglines that we've been using around it is that it's a retirement speech for the last truck driver in America after all long haul trucks become self driving. So there was an incarnation of this, the monologue that kind of anchors this whole show that existed since about 2017. I was asked to perform in a theater experiment called Wrecking Ball, and a number of different artists were given a topic and had 10 minutes to kind of present on that topic. So 2017, a lot of people were talking about Trump and kind of how the future might look like with that and these new ideas that were kinda just coming in at the time, and to me, that stuff was interesting for sure, but, like, what I was fascinated with was automation. So, I had been reading a lot about, what's happening in Amazon warehouses and how, a lot of the jobs there had been outsourced to robots, basically. They were trying to make, all the warehouse, as automated as possible in that way, and I was looking at the manual labor world, and some of those things were echoed in simple stuff like, even just grocery stores replacing cashiers with self checkout machines. Soon thereafter, there became the delivery robots that were kind of running around Toronto for a little bit pre-pandemic that were starting to deliver food and these other things. And all of this, when I started to think about what things would look like in another 10 years, I was like, oh, the writing is on the wall for a lot of these like manual labor jobs. Like a lot of it seems like it's going away. So I had written this retirement speech for a long haul truck driver, at this fictional conference that was going on and had done that speech and it had gone quite well. People seemed to really respond to that kind of 10-minute version that I had performed myself. And yeah, so I just kept on kind of thinking about that as a concept, and more as the years went by, it just seemed to become more and more relevant to everything that was going on. So, what I didn't know is how much it would be relevant to like my own profession. By the time we're finally kind of getting this thing produced.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that has been seeping in to a lot of industries is AI.
Mhm.
And I hate to call it AI because it's, large model generative algorithms essentially, or large language models essentially. But it is a lot of companies are jumping into that and trying to figure out how they can use that. How can they reduce their staff by using AI? If you work in customer service, there's always the talk of like, oh, what if we had like an AI bot? That sort of stuff. Um, in the kind of things that you're working in, are you seeing that seep into the writing work?
Yeah. So one of the reasons why I felt like truck was so prevalent to be able to put on now and why this seemed like the time for the show is because of AI. It's not a show about AI in so many senses, but a lot of the themes cross over in many ways. In my own life, previous to coming on full time at the Globe, what I was doing is kind of splitting my time between some television work, been writing for a number of different shows for a couple different years, some freelance journalism, some theater work, but the bulk of my income on a day-to-day basis was coming from copywriting. So I was doing copywriting for tech companies, and that's how I afforded to pay my rent and my bills most of the time, while pursuing these other dreams that did not kind of pay my rent and my bills a lot of the time. And a thing happened about 2 years ago. I was working as a copywriter for a smart home company on a 4-month contract, and about halfway through the contract, my boss at that point was like, "Hey, have you heard of Chat GPT?" Of course, I was familiar with that at that time, but I was like, I'm a writer. Why would I? This has nothing to do with me in some senses. And what they were really prevalent on, or what they really pushed rather, was yeah, it was like, could we use AI and these large language models to be able to kind of push out more copy and kind of double the amount of work that we had been putting out. And I don't think anyone on the team or even the bosses thought that the ads that the AI was making were any better than what humans wrote, but they were good enough. And so kind of overnight, what my contract became went from like writing these like pithy little ads, holiday ads for the smart home company, to editing the ads that robot put out. And I was like, okay, cool. Like, I was just very aware at that point that the way that I made my living was going to dramatically change. I wasn't very interested in doing the editing for that type of stuff. That's not what I got into writing for. And also, just like, even as a copywriter, I take a lot of pride in my work. So I was just not interested in kind of doing it that way. But more and more, I saw so many of those jobs just dry up, and contracts that had been very lucrative for me and that I had kind of been able to rely on through years of experience at that point just did not exist in the same capacity anymore. So, while I had thought about this on a kind of like hypothetical, 15, 20 years from now level of what that might mean for manual labor in some ways, I hadn't really realized how much it was kind of coming for my work as well. So that is a very big undercurrent of the text that's kind of going along with the play.
It is the whole AI thing is has kind of been as I see more and more companies leaning into it, I get more and more disappointed.
Mhm.
Um, Partially because I mean, uh, uh, do you know Adam Conover?
I don't think I do.
Yeah,
No.
he used to do a show called Adam Ruins Everything online, and he was a big voice in the Writers Guild strike in the States. But he talks a lot about technology and things like that, and he's been talking to a few people about AI and how essentially the technology has stalled. Um, the promise of AI is unfulfilled because the best they can do is still summarizing emails and generating some text. But that the amount of information needed to go to the next level does not exist.
Yeah. I mean, like, I don't think that we're kind of getting to the point where, it's going to be able to write novels or whatever else. But like, the challenge of that is I don't think a lot of people care. Um,
Yeah.
like I hear you with that, but it's just like I'm of two minds about it because I think that you know, in some ways it means that people who can write and people who do this for a living and people who have real skill with it, that skill set becomes even more valuable as less people can do it.
Hmm.
Like,
Hmm.
the idea of like people being able to write well and concisely put together an idea, whether that's a speech, whether that's email, whether that's whatever. Like the language in that way becomes more important as less people have that skill. And for a long time, I thought because I'm surrounded by journalists and playwrights and theater people that everybody kind of was able to kind of do the stuff that I do. And more, I'm realizing that's not true. So there's that aspect of it that I think is the bright side of a lot of what's going on. And I do think that, a lot of this technology is stalled in some ways, but like I also don't think that um the good enough is there for a lot of people,
Yeah.
whether that's, kids writing their essays or, quote unquote writing their essays to kind of put this stuff in here, or whether that's people posting their LinkedIn inspirational quotes, like all of that stuff, like it's yeah, it's a they if they don't understand, the full value in a day-to-day basis, then, like, the AI writing is gonna be good enough with that.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's a reality for a lot of things. And when I think about this, like, it's also when I'm talking about it, like, I think that there was a lot of, like, Luddite smash the computers, uh, Unabomber manifesto light conversation that was kind of coming my way a lot of the time. I was angry. I was really pissed off about it for a long period. But when I think about it now, it's just like, this stuff is here, right? Like, it's we're not putting that genie back in the bottle. So how do we want to approach it in ways that kind of seem as responsible as possible? And like,
Hmm.
how are we trying to figure out ways to be able to live with this as best we can? Because I don't really feel like there's another option as much as I wish there were.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, where do you, as far as like as a tool, where do you land on using it, and how do you use it, if at all?
Yeah, I don't use it, in my writing. Like, I think that that would be irresponsible of me, and um, not to toot my own horn too much with this stuff, but I can do a better job
Yeah.
than AI can in terms of like sounding voicey and sounding like myself.
Right.
One of the things that I did find interesting though, it was this very monkey's paw situation is over the last year, the contract wrapped up now, but I was writing about new technologies for Dropbox. They have a blog and I was writing an article a month for that because it was a nice little gig for me and it paid a lot. And when I got hired on, they were talking about like how are we finding the intersections of technology and disability, which is one of the things that I'm quite passionate as a person who has visual issues. But the person who hired me on immediately went on mat leave, and then the job became writing about AI. Um, and so they're trying to find positive use cases for it. So, like, I mean, I don't use it for writing or anything like that, but I have noticed there's an app called Be My Eyes that for anybody who's visually impaired or blind, it can take a photo or a video of what's in front of you and then describe it back to you in real time of what's going on there. And a tool like that is invaluable for a lot of people. It really opens up a lot of possibilities. Right now, they're working with language models to be able to figure out how to translate sign language in real
Mm.
time using AI, so that folks are able to better communicate and understand um, in situations that had not been previously open to them.
Mm.
There's AI therapists that I've used for articles that are trying to fill stock gaps right now in terms of like the mental health crisis that's going on across North America. And there's, problems with these things, certainly. But like, I do think that there's like, um, to be entirely doom and gloom about it, I think is a little naive in some ways. I think that there are positive use cases for these things. And I think that there are ways that they're going to be beneficial in the future in some ways. But what gets me angry about it is this idea that like, a lot of the skill set that me and my friends have worked very hard on and
Mm.
is much more difficult than a lot of people would give it credit for is kind of being devalued by um, yeah, like people who think that again this good enough mentality kind of comes through on it. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's here, and I think that so we have to try to figure out ways to use it as positively as we can. um, I think if you're a writer and you're using it, or a creative writer and you're using it, you're being lazy and you shouldn't have your job anymore. But it's another conversation.
I mean, I've occasionally, as a curious person, I've used it, but I've used it and been like, "R- write this, and I hate everything it puts out, but that teaches me that I hate it, right? Like these are the initial things that this puts out. I hate every one of these.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
like, I think that there's curiosity with it for sure, but
hmm.
there was also curiosity. I don't remember if, you know, I'm dating myself a little bit here, but there was a bot early in kind of the AOL chat room days, MSN chat room days called
Hmm.
Smarter Child,
Hmm.
that, you could chat to and would chat back to you in the same way that AI is doing now. And that existed in like 2006,
Yeah.
and I remember being fascinated by that of just like, okay, this ghost in the machine, a Blade Runner-esque thing that's going on. And I was curious on that level. And I think that there's still some spike of curiosity in me in terms of like, you know, what does it mean to talk to machines in this way? And like, how are we approaching those types of things in terms of like, all right, thinking about yeah, broader conversations around loneliness and feelings of isolation in those ways. Like that's
Mm.
fascinating to me for sure. And like I can understand like the use case for being like curious about what it does, because it's a it's like a Google search engine that hallucinates. You're
Yeah.
something kind of
Yeah.
curious about that on some level too. I just like if you're I think a lot of time when people are talking about writer's block or talking about like oh, it can come up with these ideas from you. It's just like think you should try harder
Yeah.
instead.
I mean, it's true. I don't remember what year it was. It was a couple of years ago or within the last year. There was, I think there was a Fringe Festival show that was like, we're working with an AI generated script, and there was a lot of backlash, understandably, about the idea of at a Fringe Festival that's always been about people and indie stuff. Um, using AI generated play. Um, and I think it also spoke to a lot of the fears that were going on at the time with the Writers Guild and the Actors Guild in the States, all sort of like being on strike about the same kind of thing. Um, it is, but again, I think they thought they were doing it, or they said they were doing it as an experiment, but it's really hard to get past.
Yeah, I think if people if there weren't people actively trying to use this stuff to replace creative people entirely, then I think that there would be more of a use case in a sort of like you know, like uh sort of pop art kind of way to be able to look at it, in terms of just like the Warhol of it all, in terms of
Hmm.
just like what is reproduction, like when we're talking about like theorists like Walter Benjamin, like where it's just like okay, do we lose something in the copy of something, or if it's not, if there's no if we're moving it so far removed from like the first iteration of this, like what does it mean for the like soul of this thing? And I think that there's kind of some interesting question in there, potentially, but, like, I just haven't found a use case for it creatively in that way, and I think
Yeah.
if people are trying to, like, engage it, on that level, that there's something that's kind of fascinating to me with it, but I don't think that that's most people going on, you know?
No.
Like, I think that, most people is just like, "Okay, well, I don't wanna write my wedding vows or,
Yeah.
like, my my
Yeah.
my little paragraphs." It was just like and I think that, I was thinking about this today a lot, that all of this stuff is hard, right? Like I think that it takes a skill set and work and talent and time to really hone the craft in some ways to be able to get to the point where you can feel confident in your art, in your writing. But the value, a lot of the time, on a personal level, is the struggle of that thing. Trying to figure out what something is, trying to bring something to life that only existed in your head before that, and trying to create the best version of that. Like there's something very joyous, and that's like my favorite way to spend time. Theater in so many ways feels largely impossible to do right now on like a
Mm.
financial level, and on a creative level, it's difficult to be able to like figure out how to put in the proper amount of time and effort and resources, money to make something go up. But at its heart, it's just like, okay, well, you're working with your friends or a group of people to bring something to life that only existed in somebody's head before that, and that's magic to me. That's wizardry. That's everything. And like, uh, I think skipping the steps in between is really robbing people of yeah, the joy of what that thing is. It's
Mhm.
just like that's why it matters to me a lot of time. And I think that the mistakes and the challenges and the things that like feel very unique to the person are always what draw me to the art more than any sort of perfection of it. And if
Yeah.
we don't have that, like if it doesn't exist because something else made it, it has nothing to do with humans, then like I'm just really not that interested in it.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard there was a phrase going around that I don't really wanna see art that nobody cared to make.
Mhm, mhm. I think that's
And
great.
yeah, and you know, uh, to it is almost like unfathomable to me that somebody wants to write a book without having written it, or like write a play without having written it. Like that, like you said, it's a joy for me to be writing. Not revising so much, but it's part of the process that you have to go through. But like the writing of something, that's a joy.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's just like uh it's worthwhile doing because it's hard. Um, there's the Ira Glass quote that he talks about all the time, that like the real challenge a lot of the time of being a young creative is that you have good taste, but the things that you're making don't live up to your tastes.
Yeah.
And a creative life and like the work is really figuring out how to bridge that gap a lot of the time. And I think that I can understand from a person who's not driven creatively in that way that like to want to skip all that steps, like
Mm.
just go from like the idea to the thing, instantly. But uh the idea, like, a lot of people can have ideas. It's really what the making of the thing is where the skill is and the
Yeah.
talent and yeah, just why it matters to me in so much senses. So, yeah, I think a lot of that has come back to kind of like why I'm trying to put on this play right now.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
like I think that there's aspects of AI that certainly exist in this, but like even in putting up the show right now, like we didn't get our grant funding and Factory, who is co-producing with us, has been very generous to donate some resources and time. And this would not be happening without them. But it's kind of figuring out how to beg, borrow, and steal to make the rest happen. And as we've done that, like I think it's been really important to me to try to, even in the stagecraft of this right now, because we don't have the resources or funds to make something. Um, that feels like really larger than life and big. I was just like, well, can we just show the work? You know what I mean? Like there's something kind of interesting in like um staging it that way. So it's
Mm.
just like pretty bare bones stage. We have our sound designer who is also like performing live on stage with us, is trying to show the edifice of the work right now to really like yeah, hit on some of the themes of what's happening. But there's something about the rawness of that feels very appealing to me right now.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's also just like amongst all this other things of like, hey, we're trying to make something as big as possible all the time and as flashy and doing that without any of the work. It was just like, well, yeah, I'd rather show you all the guts of this thing as much as I can.
Yeah. I mean, the wonderful thing about theater is that an audience will accept it. Like,
Yeah.
if all
Yeah.
of the pieces aren't there, the audience will accept and just, like, go with it, which is always a wonderful thing about the theater.
Yeah, and I mean, like, like, I'll watch a Robert Lepage show and be in awe of that stuff in terms of what he's able to put together, with something like that, or these giant, stuff that has this movie stages at the Shaw or the Stratford or whatever, and I like a lot of that work, and I think there's a lot of creativity that can kinda go into that to make the set and the costuming and the lighting and all that, like, really sing. But for me, I'm kinda like, "Hey, if we got a good script and we got some good actors, that's usually enough."
Yeah.
Like, I'm
Yeah.
interested in the story of the thing a lot of the time, and I think there's many different ways to tell that story, and,
Mm.
I'd happily take the big budget version of this if that was a possibility, but, like, we have some really incredible actors in this show. I'm very proud of the script, the sound design's awesome, and I was like, "Alright, well, let's just get out of the way and see if people respond to it."
Um, Now I can cut this out if you're not interested in talking about this.
Sure.
But one of the things that you wrote when we were sort of like initially talking about this was about the production, not getting the grant, and um, how you feel if we're feeling like this might be the last time you do this.
Yeah, I have been talking about that a little bit. Like, I think that I'm very aware in what's happening right now that like, um, it's been very challenging over the past kind of decade to be able to put up work that, for all intents and purposes, has been quite successful. Like, I've got won awards and I've gotten produced, um, in Ireland and in Berlin and all these different places, and I've done summer works, half a dozen times, and we won awards at the Fringe and all this stuff. And I think I do feel at this point that I believe very heavily in my playwriting abilities and the work that I'm able to do there. But what's challenging to me is not the idea that like, okay, it's not even that like I'm fine with not getting paid for this stuff, which because I'm in a privileged position that I have jobs, other writing jobs that I can afford this stuff. What becomes more difficult is the idea that I lose money doing stuff that is successful. And that's the challenge of it, like Factory, with the co-production here, it was just like they've given us the tons and tons and tons of resources, and we could not be doing this without them. But we're really relying on trying to get an arts council grants, or a Canada Council grant to kind of get this done, and even being a part of a person's season, even having a cast of known actors who have a number of accolades behind them, a workshop that sold out and did really well, some great quotes, letters of recommendation, all that stuff. It just didn't come through. So I spent X amount of times like writing those grants that didn't happen, but I still really believe in the show and wanted to do it. And like it's a tiny violin because I know so many other people who create indie theater like are also in this boat. I'm just feeling like a lot of ways that like I don't know if I can risk putting up, X amount of my own money again. That fingers crossed we'll make back, if ticket sales and everything goes well. But to spend, half a year of my life or more kind of putting up a show that ultimately, is gonna pay me less than, like, one freelance article I could do.
Mm.
And so, yeah, it's just there's a little bit of, I'm feeling in many ways that it's just like, this is probably the last time that I produce a play. I don't know if it's the last thing I'll ever do in theater, and I think it's quite possibly that that's true. And there's something that's a little sad about that to me in some ways, but,
Mm.
I'm also entirely grateful that, there's X amount of people who have come in under rate right now, or have, like, put aside their rate for the moment to and hopefully there'll be a profit shared enough to pay them back later, because we all believe in the show, right? We all really wanna do it. There's rose-colored glasses to that for sure, but there's
Mm.
also something kind of amazing. So, as a financial way to make money or, as a living, I don't think theater in Canada is something that I could suggest for many people, but I think if anybody has any inclination towards it at all, I really hope that they get to do it too, because when it all comes together, there's absolutely nothing I enjoy more. So yeah, and I'm of two minds about it in that way, but it's just that I think anybody listening to this podcast, I feel like a lot of folks will know like just how hard it is to try to make something work and be financially viable.
I mean, I think the it's the financially viable stuff that's the hardest, and I don't know. My perception is, and I could be wrong, that it is uniquely a Canadian issue, in the way that we fund things, in the way that we have this weird perception about um, Canadian work and how and its place in the grand scheme of the arts, that it might be less than what comes out of the UK or the US. And also, I think I don't know. There's a there. I think there might be there's funding issues. Obviously,
Mhm.
I remember years ago. There was an actor who was they were on the cover of Now. Again, this dates me, but they were on the cover of the Now magazine, which is a big deal for a theater artist. And they were saying that at the same time they were on the cover of the Now, they were wondering how they were going to make their rent.
Yeah. And I think that that's been a reality for so many people, in this industry for quite some time. And like, I don't know, like I think I used to kind of get very angry about the granting process and like, what more do we need to do to kind of get this through? But truthfully, there's a lot of great artists, a lot of people like vying for you know
Hmm.
funding that just a smaller pot in some ways, and as cost of living has changed and all of this stuff, and
Yeah.
so, I don't really have sour grapes in terms of that, like, there's like, I really believe in my art, but, like, there's a lot of great artists, and I'm really glad that somebody's getting money out there to be able to do it.
Hmm.
It's just
Hmm.
in these ways, it was just like, I don't know, at this point in my mid-30s, like, what I'm seeing here, I feel less okay asking people, um, to work for free or, like, trying to figure out this, like, uh, yeah, just this kinda, like, collective spirit of how we're all doing it. That said, like, nobody's working for free on this show, but, like,
Yeah.
it's, they're under rates of what they could be right now,
Hmm.
and,
Hmm.
like, we're hustling to try to figure out to get them how to get them to their rates, and, fingers crossed we'll sell the ticket sales to be able to do that, but, like, yeah, I'm entirely grateful for, like, that type of stuff happening, but it
Hmm.
just feels in so many ways that, like, um especially having spent like the last couple years, in addition to copywriting and all these and freelance journalism, all that stuff, I was also writing on a TV show for the past couple years, and like uh, the gap in terms of just like what I got paid for one episode of TV versus what I got paid for like my most lucrative theater contracts
Mm.
ever. It's just like it's not comparable in so
Yeah.
many ways. Like
Yeah.
one is a way that you can make a living, and the other is just like, I'm hesitant to call it a hobby because I feel like what I do is professional, and and we've done it at on this like big level on a lot of time, but it's just like practically, I was like, I'd get paid more doing literally anything else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. It is, and producing is exhausting, and I think that people don't often know that until they've done it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's unsung heroes. A lot of folks who are doing this stuff. It's a lot less fun, at least for me, than um, you know, uh, all of the artistic sides of this. But
Mm-hmm.
it's hard in so many senses too, because it was just like, in addition to like having to do so many emails and keep a budget and all this other stuff. I'm also trying to figure out how to direct and then do some rewrites on the script and figure out some marketing and photos and all of this other stuff. And so there's just a lot of hats to wear. And I went into this like very grateful for the opportunity to do this play. And again, like this doesn't happen without the support of Factory and the resources that they've afforded myself and the crew. But like, yeah, it's just like uh, we like even like we didn't ask for the full amounts for the grants. Like even 15 grand from one place would have like been tremendously changing for this show.
Right.
And like that's a lot of money and it's not in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's just like those are the realities of the situation. And like I don't think I'm very unique in kind of feeling that way.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of just feeling like, yeah, a little tired, a little burned out by these things. Which is a big contrast to kind of the idea of like how I present my work a lot of the time and how fortunate I've been to like have people write about the shows and be very kind of like out there in a lot of ways with what I put on. So it's a real contradiction a lot of the time. And I feel like uh yeah, just like at this point in my life when I'm thinking about where I want to put time and resources into, like I felt like it had to be this play now. Like this play felt very important for me, and
Mm-hmm.
this feels like the moment for it. Um, but yeah, I can't see in terms of writing something new or putting that stuff together. I'd much rather take that time and put it into a TV project or a movie project or something because it seems like such a crapshoot to get anything produced in theater that
Mm-hmm.
I might as well take those risks and try to make literally like 12 times the amount of money. So um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about Shortsighted.
for sure.
Um, because this is a podcast documenting your experience with vision loss, and I I'm curious how that came together. Did they approach you? Did you approach them? How did the idea of telling your visual story through an audio means come to you?
Yeah, so Shortsighted, for folks who don't know, it's a 5-part CBC podcast that I hosted and wrote about my vision loss. I have a degenerative condition called keratoconus, and for the past decade or so, that's progressed pretty rapidly to the point where now no longer able to drive. Uh, I have trouble with bright lights. I can't really tell the details of a lot of folks' faces anymore unless they're very close up to me. So yeah, that was something that I had been writing about for a number of different publications, and writing about how that had changed my approach to work and how things were going on there. So I thought I was done with art for a while, and I was going to take a very lucrative bank job that I was offered doing some creative UX writing that was going to pay me more money than I ever thought I'd be paid for anything my whole life. And when I went to go get trained for it, it turns out that I couldn't actually see the screen well enough to be able to do the job.
Mm,
None of us really had factored in that that was going to be um, a problem. Yeah, there's just nothing. When I had approached that job and gone through the interview process, that kind of signaled that. So those folks were very cool to me. When I said, "Hey, I don't think this is working out," and tried to figure out ways to work around it, but ultimately, like I left that job, and I did a article in Toronto Life that about that process that picked up a lot of steam. So much so that yeah, when there was a couple different streams that were happening for CBC Gem. about documentary, and I ended up taking some of what was in that essay and trying to make a visual doc with it. So we got pretty far along in that process with CBC Gem, and then ultimately, when it came down to the funding time, they were like, "Hey, we really love this idea, but we're having like just trouble figuring out what it would look like on a visual level, which is so important for docs." And it was just like, well, yeah, me too. That's the whole point. The not knowing about the visual level is kind of the whole thing of this. So I was complaining about that to some friends. One of who, Leah, who is one of the hosts of Secret Life Canada, and she's like, "Hey, do you think it would work for CBC podcasts? Like what happened if you took the visuals out of it entirely?" Uh, and yeah, so we went through a couple different rounds with them, and that's how that project kind of came to light. So it was adapted from a documentary that I was trying to put together for CBC Gem. And then we started thinking about like if we no longer center visual language, um, or like a visual presentation when talking about vision loss, like how would that feel? And yeah, so that was kind of the birth of the show. Uh, yeah, and I'd done some of that stuff and some of the stories that ended up in that podcast. Live, different storytelling nights and such. There was a workshop production that happened at Tarragon of like a storytelling version of the podcast that did pretty decently, but ultimately it ended up, uh, yeah, as a podcast for CBC.
Had you done audio work like that before?
No, no, but I had been, uh, a lot of my background was live storytelling as well too,
Mhm.
and that's something that I had done a lot in addition to playwriting. Uh, uh, since my early 20s. So that was one man shows, and that was all of these different things. And through some of that work, I had been in touch with some producers over at CBC and some producers at This American Life, which is a show that was on NPR, is now its own thing. But yeah, I chat with some of those folks about storytelling and structure, and I put them in touch to get some stories on air for other folks and things. So I had a sense of like what I wanted to do with it, but had never done anything that was just straight audio focused before that.
Hmm. One of the fascinating things about audio for me is I've heard it described as the most visual medium. In that, um, when it's done really well, it can spark the imagination of the person listening so that they will experience the audio drama as though they're watching it, which is a
Mm,
fascinating thing that I think I've listened to stuff where that's happened. And it's a fascinating idea about treating the audio in that way.
for sure. I think there's an intimacy that goes along with audio that I'm really interested in. And I love shows like WTF or Working It Out with Mike Birbiglia or a bunch of the kind of the just interview shows I think are really great. But the stuff that I have been drawn to from a very young age was kind of these audio documentary. Um, and I think that there's something very interesting about what happens if you're no longer focusing on the visuals of things. So in addition to that stuff, what I've been fascinating in the last couple of years is a lot of the audio narrative shows. Oscar Isaac's production company had put together a number of different kind of radio plays type things that have been extremely fascinating and that I got super interested in just the ability to kind of listen and create worlds through that type of stuff. And when I was thinking about my own show, it was just like, okay, well, if we're trying to talk about vision loss, it was like, how are we doing this without just blurring a picture, right? Like, what is the sense of like, what's the tenor and tone of these things, and how are
Mm,
we trying to give people a way in that isn't kind of wholly rooted in visual language? So, kind of like a synesthesia metaphor, in terms of just
mm,
like how we're using like one sense to evoke another. So,
mhm.
yeah, we're trying to create like a sense of space a lot of the time through the audio there, and I think that that's bled into a lot of my work in the last couple of years. So particularly with Truck, with this new play, Ron Kelly, who did the composition for Shortsighted, the podcast, is also the uh, sound designer and composer for Truck. And it's a show that's very rooted in kind of a auditory language to hopefully create a sense of space. And knowing that we weren't going to be able to build big sets or Ford, a lighting designer or anything like that. It was just like, okay, how are we trying to create a sense of, um, these protests and then these different locations through the sound. So we have that kind of going on, and it's also rooted in this sort of like retro futurist, like 2010s version of the future thing. So it all sounds a lot like sort of Justice and Daft Punk and
Hmm.
all of these electronic musics that I really was into at the time period. So yeah, it's very interesting to think of just in terms of like what audio brings to life, other rather than what other mediums do.
Yeah. When you talk about audio being so intimate, I often think about how, like, when I'm doing a podcast or thinking about podcasts, I'm always cognizant of the fact that a lot of people are listening to this like directly in their ears.
Mhm.
There's not even air between them and the medium that's pumping it into their ears. And so you are essentially like speaking directly into the ears of the person that's listening. Um, and that can be it's a very powerful thing when you think about that. Um, Especially if you're telling a really intimate, quiet story.
Yeah, and I think it creates a sense of that you know people in a different way. I'm sure you've had listeners kind of come up who have listened to the show, who have who you might not know personally, but have a sense of who you are through this time period. Uh,
Mhm.
and yeah, like you're spending, an hour each week or an hour every couple of weeks with somebody in your ear that way. And I think
Mhm.
about even my closest friends at this point in my life, it's just like I don't get that consistency with a lot of them. So it kind of builds those parasocial relationships or those like that real feeling of like trust with your audience and with the creators that I really enjoyed and I've been it's been I had that relationship with a lot of my favorite shows and have
Mm.
been very fortunate in terms of getting some feedback for Shortsighted in terms of, yeah, just the way that people have approached that.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, Graham, I wanna ask you a little bit about, your history with theater and how you came to be involved in it. For me, a performer or a theater person's origin story is always a fascinating thing. How did you discover both writing and theater for yourself, and how did it become a thing you really wanted to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always, in some senses, had aspirations to be a writer since, kind of like my preteen days. I read a lot as a kid. And then around my 12th or 13th birthday, my dad gave me the Kurt Vonnegut novel, Breakfast of Champions. And I was just like, oh, a book can do this? Like it blew my mind in terms of like what the form could be and how to approach those things. And shortly thereafterwards, I was trying to find some interesting pop lit, stuff like Nick Hornby and Douglas Copeland, and just like really trying to figure out a way to be like, oh, these people seem like rock stars to me. It was the most interesting thing in the world, and I think from very young age, like I knew that I had aspirations to kind of be doing that type of stuff. Journalism was another way in for me. I started interviewing bands when I was very young. Doing my first couple interviews with some local punk bands and then some punk bands who end up being quite big, around my 13th and 14th birthday and writing for some local kind of photocopied signs. So all of that stuff was pretty prevalent in my early life and that trajectory seemed pretty clear to me when I was little and uh, has been straightforward from there. My way into theater a lot of the time was just like, I was playing in bands and I had this love of performing, but I just wasn't that talented as a musician. Like I loved being on stage and I loved sharing stories and the banter in between songs was some of my favorite parts. And so a lot of that kind of started to bleed over into like one man show stuff and even some early monologues like way back when I was sort of like 17, 18 years old. Started writing and performing those for myself. But yeah, like I'd done some theater in high school as well too, and was very encouraged for that. So when I got to university, the assumption was just kind of like, hey, I'm going to barrel through a degree at U of T so I can go continue working as a music journalist, which I had been doing anyways. But the degree was like a means to get to Toronto and a way to appease my parents at the time. And then there was no music journalism by the time I was kind of, in my mid-20s, like, the jobs and that had just kinda really gone away a lot of the time. So, all that stuff just meant that, like, I was trying to find different outlets to be able to express myself creatively. Yeah, and theater kinda popped up in that as well too. So, I'd done a little bit in high school and then continued to pursue it in university because I didn't know what else I was going to do as kind of um, for my undergrad as a secondary thing to English. And then got some really nice feedback from folks like Guillermo Verdecchia and Janet Sears and on my writing. And they were like, hey, you should really try to think about pursuing this more. And, embarked on a life of poverty and freedom from there.
Yeah. Um, in terms of like writing, you mentioned doing solo plays and things like that. Um, there's a difference when you're writing a solo play and when you're writing like a, I guess you'd call it a straight up play. For you, um, how is writing each of those different?
Yeah, solo plays are easier to me a lot of the time. And storytelling's a lot easier to me. I think I've just flexed those muscles a lot more in terms of what I do a lot of the time at the Globe or at Vice or at other places that I've written before was like these personal essays and this long form stuff, which felt very adjacent to a lot of my solo plays. And I had done uh, I think three of those, like three solo shows, hour long solo shows, over the course of my career. And yeah, so that stuff felt very natural to me, and I didn't really need anybody else to be able to kind of play it up. And yeah, writing like narrative plays and plays that work that way, it's just like yeah, it's very different. And like I think the process of that it's like a little bit harder, but ultimately kind of more rewarding for me too. It's like trying to figure out how to tell a more complete story. A lot of my work is really still rooted in monologue. Like the end of this show is a giant monologue. The my last play, White Heat, which was about the rise of white supremacy and how journalists respond to that in North America, was back and forth monologues for an hour before one scene together. So a lot of that stuff feels still really prevalent within my work, and I like that a lot. But yeah, it's just mapping it and figuring out what happens in a narrative show. I don't find the writing of it too hard, but the mapping of stuff feels challenging in a whole different way, and just requires a different part of my brain rather than just kind of like talking and saying what happens.
Mm, yeah. No, just as we start to get to the wind down of our conversation, um, I want to ask where people can find you online.
Yeah, God, social media is such a strange thing nowadays. Well, what still exists there? I'm Presgang with one S, Presgang on Instagram. Um, Graham Isador on Blue Sky there. And yeah, I'm around for those types of things. I'm a very online person, so
Yeah, yeah,
with that type of stuff. But I'm floating around mostly on those things nowadays. And then yeah, I got a couple things a week at the Globe and Mail as well too nowadays.
nice, nice. And Truck is at the Factory Studio Theater, uh, March 26th to 30th.
26th to 30th, God willing, we'll be announcing a extension week very soon if ticket sales continue to hold the way that they have. So fingers crossed that that's happening too the week after. But right now, the 26th to the 30th, and yeah, tickets are starting to move for that. So if you're coming, I suggest try to grab them as soon as possible.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Graham, thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate you coming on. Thanks for giving your time.
Yeah, very excited to do it. It's a show that I've listened to for a long time. And I'm glad you're getting started.
Thank you.